Welcome to the presentation on the Individual Education Program, or IEP process. My name is Dr. Amy Hughes, and I'm a course mentor for the Special Ed program. And today we're going to discuss these different areas to help you understand what the process is all about. For this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about what special ed is. We're going to go through the process, and we're going to discuss the different components of the IEP, required team members, writing the IEP and deciding placement, what happens after the IEP, annual requirements, and tips for addressing parental concerns. The heart of special ed essentially is the IEP. It's crucial for parents, teachers, other school staff, administrators, service providers to come together and use teamwork to really develop an individual program that the student can achieve their goals, they can make progress, and they can take part in the general ed curriculum. When we look at different forms, there are basic components that are required by the federal government, and sometimes you'll see that states will have a little bit different wording or things that are added, but the basic federal requirements are always there. One of the things that states have is a little bit of flexibility in how they produce their forms and how their forms are set up. So while every state may have kind of a different look or order to their forms, they still have those federal requirements. And so it's important to look at the differences and just be aware that not all the IEPs that you see will look exactly the same. So this graphic depicts the basic special ed process that's required under IDEA. And feel free to pause at any time just to look at the graphic and kind of go through the steps and just make sure you're familiar with them. In this process, there are 10 steps, as you can see here. And in the next slide, we're going to go through the different components and talk a little bit about each one. So the different processes of the IEP start with the child being identified for services. Services can be started through the child find process or through a referral or request for evaluation. In the child find process, typically this occurs when the child is very young, 0 to 3, and you'll see referrals from people like pediatricians, daycare providers, and social workers, things like that. You also can take part in child find screenings that are, located throughout and put on by typically state departments and agencies to identify if your child has needs. The other is through a referral once they get into grade school, or even middle school, high school, a referral typically from the general ed teacher and a request for evaluation. This can also come from the parents as well. Prior to the child being evaluated, we have to request permission from the parents, and once this is in place, we can evaluate the child in all areas that are related to the child's suspected disability. So the results are going to be used to determine if the child is eligible. So we're going to be looking at IQ testing, achievement testing, social, adaptive, behavioral, just depending on what the needs of the student are. We can we can use those different assessments to really focus in on those needs and get the most accurate results. Once all the results come together, eligibility has to be decided. And once all these assessments are completed, observations are done, and the team comes together and discusses, what the results have in store, we can determine whether or not the child is defined as a child with a disability, or if the child does not qualify. If the child is found eligible, then we can go forward and proceed with special ed and related services to start looking at getting an IEP meeting scheduled. So once we have the meeting scheduled, we're going to hold the meeting and we're going to write it together. Now, one tip is to kind of come to the meeting prepared with ideas, but you never want to have the IEP pre-written. This is a team decision, and we're coming together to discuss what the child needs, and so every team member has to have input on that. So while we have our tips and our ideas and what we're going to work through, for our agenda and things like that, we never want to have a pre-written IEP. It's just really important that parents and other team members have the ability to partake, present ideas, and that it is written together. The other part is we decide when services are provided, and this is when we make sure it's kind of for accuracy and for accountability, for responsibility, to make sure that the IEP is being carried out as it was written. Parents are also given a copy of the IEP. The next part, progress being measured and reported. I feel that this takes part throughout the whole entire process. We always want to be looking to make sure that the child is making progress toward the goals. We want to make sure that the goals aren't too hard to where the student gets frustrated, or too easy to where they're meeting the goal within a week. We really want to make sure that it's tailored to what they need. It's also really important to involve the parents and keep them informed of their child's progress. And that can be determined by a set up schedule if you want to report more often, but the bare minimum is for it to be reported whenever the general ed students get a report card. Progress reports have to go out at that same time. But if you determine, or if the parents request to have progress reports more often, then that's acceptable as well. Once progress is measured and the IEP is in place, the next step is to have an IEP review. Now, this happens annually and is required to happen annually, but if there are amendments or things that have to be changed, or if it's deemed necessary to have an IEP before that annual time frame comes up, that's perfectly acceptable. One of the things that is typically done is to have an amendment form attached to the IEP, just documenting that changes had been made. It's still really important, though, for that, while you don't have to hold a full-blown IEP meeting, that you have documentation and signatures, that you've contacted, the parents and administrator, and that everybody knows that these amendments and these upgrades, so to speak, have occurred. Finally, step of the process 10, the child is reevaluated, and this happens every 3 years, that we look at IQ's achievement testing, kind of like we did at the initial, just to determine whether or not the student still receives services. The next area that we're looking at is the contents of the IEP. There's also 10 areas here that you'll see on the majority of forms. Please feel free here to pause the graphic as well and take a look at the different areas. In the next section, we're going to be going through each of these. So the first one that we're going to look at is current performance. And this is where the IEP really gives a lot of information of what we're looking for in regards to the areas of need for the student. This area talks about baseline and what the child is currently doing in school. So the data that we collect here is going to be really important to determine whether the annual goals align and that the student is receiving services in their area of need. In this area, we really want to be detailed and provide current baseline. We want to provide strengths of the student in the subject area. We want to provide needs of the student in the subject area. We want to talk about the data, both qualitative and quantitative. So we're looking at numbers and we're looking at observations and we're looking at different data collection procedures, whether they're checklists or interviews. All that is included here. And we're looking at how the disability affects the child's performance in the regular classroom. So these are 5 areas that have to be included in every current performance area. That then ties into the annual goals. And the annual goals are goals that tie in to that current performance area. We want to have the subjects, they have to align. So if we have a student that is struggling in reading, we want their annual goals to address those struggles, those particular issues that student has in reading. And we want these goals to be something that the child can reasonably accomplish within a year. You also have IEPs where these goals can be broken down into short-term objectives or benchmarks, and they're just smaller pieces of the goal that as we complete those smaller steps, it is still building up to the completion of that annual goal. The next area that we have is the special ed and related services. And this is the area of the IEP that lists the different services, time in different places, whether or not the student has physical therapy, speech therapy, OT, anything like that is to be provided to the child or on behalf of the child. We also discussed participation with peers. And the IEP has to describe if the child is not in that general ed classroom, we have to describe where they're participating at and how many minutes a week that child is away from the general ed classroom. So it's really important to make sure that the participation with peers is in line with the needs of that student. The next area is participation in testing. And so the IEP has to go through and describe what is going to happen if the child takes part in testing. And if the child isn't going to take part, it has to describe why that child not participating is appropriate. The next area is dates and places. And this is just a section that talks about if a service is being provided in a different area besides the general ed classroom, where it's being provided, and how long the services will last. So if they're going to last a month, we need to have, July 1st to July 31st listed, just so we have an idea of when the services are going to take place and how long they're going to be provided for. Some services generally are going to be within that year time frame. They're going to be provided the whole length of the year. But there are sometimes issues with transportation or things like that where it might be only for a couple months or, for a couple weeks. And if we know beforehand, that's stuff that we can put in and document so that we have an accurate representation of what's being provided. Transition services. These start beginning when the child is 14. This just kind of talks about the different courses that the student is going to be in, what they want to be once they graduate from high school, and things that they would like to, their preferences and interests. The needed transition services begin when the child is 16, and this really goes into the areas of employment, training, schooling, and independent living if necessary. And so this is where we really look at those goals and focus in on how we can help the student achieve activities that help them towards that goal while they're with us and help them with their goals to achieve once they have left us. The age of majority, at least 1 year before the child reaches the age of majority, typically this is 18 in most states, it's just an area where we document that the student has been told that they are going to become responsible for their education and for deciding what their educational goals and placement, what it's going to look like. They're going to be responsible for signing as the guardian. They're going to be in charge of themselves, so to speak, for this paperwork and for these educational needs. And then finally, measuring progress. And once again, this is something that I think goes on throughout the whole entire IEP process. We're always measuring what the student needs, how we can improve, what we need to pull back on, just always making sure that we are doing our best and providing our best to help these students achieve their goals. The next area that we're looking at are the IEP team members. And these are the individuals that have to be involved in the IEP decisions. There are identified figures here within the graphic: the student, parents, regular ed teacher, school system representative, transition service representative. Other people who may have expertise with the child, whether it be a therapist if the parents want that person there, social worker, different types of physical therapy providers, anything like that. A school psych that can provide information on evaluation results, and the special ed teacher or special ed service providers. It's important to note that some smaller districts may have people that fill in for both roles. So you may have a school psych that's also the administrator. As long as they are properly certified and have the proper credentials to do both of those roles, then they can take part and fill both of those roles, just to be sure that there's no crossing over or conflict of interest anywhere. These people that, if they do have the certification in both areas, it's okay for them to fill in two positions. It's really important that these people come together for the meeting and that they do it quickly. The time frame is 30 calendar days of deciding that the child is eligible for services. However, the sooner that you can get an IEP in place, the better off it is for everybody. It's really important that as all of these team members are taking part in the meeting, that they have important information about that student. And so it's really important to emphasize communication and teamwork for each member to provide the information on the child to really make a well-written, progressive, appropriate plan for the student. So the next part is writing the IEP. And I always like to look at this with the goal setting idea of SMART. We want the goals to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. If you use this formula, you're going to be sure to produce really well-written goals that will help the student achieve. During this time, you're going to talk about what the student is good at, you're going to talk about what they need, and we're going to look at the different types of information that we've gathered from the evaluations, from testing, from the parents for ideas of what they need. And we really want to focus all this information to provide well-written goals that address the needs of the student and are really individualized to the certain and specific areas where the child is having difficulty. So we really want to make sure that we take into consideration how the student is going to take part in different types of activities, how they're going to take part in general ed curriculum classes, and really to make sure that they are in a placement where they get to spend as much time as possible with other children in the general ed classroom. One of the main things about writing goals and having them connect is to have them connect with the present levels of performance. So we really want to make sure that those ideas flow together. The other part is we really want to make sure that they're measurable. If the goals aren't measurable, we're going to have a very hard time determining whether progress and achievement has been met. So it's really important to make sure that those aspects are clearly connected and written in the goals, just to make it easier to keep track of progress, to, keep going with what the student is working on, or how we may have to tweak and kind of work with it just to make sure that student is getting what they need to maintain progress. When we're writing goals and we're looking at the information for the student to take part within different types of settings, we really have to look at what that student needs, what's in the best interest for that student. It's important to note that while we want the student to participate fully and as much as they can in the general ed classroom, it's important to know that sometimes participation in the general ed classroom isn't as beneficial as it may seem. So if we have a student that it is better for them to be in a self-contained classroom, then that's where we need to have them be. It's just really making sure that their placement aligns with their needs. That's the most important part. There's many different types of placement. We have our general ed classroom, resource room, special schools, we have self-contained classrooms, we have residential settings, we have home settings, even different types of educational placements within hospitals, residential treatment facilities, and juvenile justice programs. So after the meeting has occurred, the IEP has been written, and we're ready to start putting services in place. This is the time that we really have to come together and make sure that everyone's on the same page, that these services will be implemented, and that these goals are what we are going to continue to work towards for the student. So we're really focused in on carrying out the IEP and what it specifically says and what specifically has to be provided to that student. So once that's completed, we want the IEP to be a copy given to the parents, and we want it to be available to people that have a specific role in the success of that child. So regular ed teachers need to have access to the document. Special ed teachers, anyone who is providing a related service like a speech therapist or an occupational therapist, and any other service provider. If we have a student that has a one-on-one, that paraprofessional should be aware of what's in that IEP to make sure that things are being followed and that the student is being provided the services that they need and working towards their goals. Remember that the IEP is a legal contract, so this is a contract between the parents and the school district. It has to be followed. So when we say we're going to provide something, we need to provide that service. The next area is annual requirements, and this is just kind of a general overview of what is required. The IEP has to be reviewed at least once a year, sometimes more if we're making amendments or if the parents request, but at bare minimum, it has to be done yearly. The other area is to make sure that the student has to be or has to be reevaluated every 3 years to determine if they still need services. So if their eligibility is still there. The last area that we're going to discuss, and certainly not the least important, because by far parental concerns are at the forefront of what we want to do. I mean, we really want to address concerns that the parents have, and we want to do it in a productive, proactive, positive way. Um, there are going to be times when the parents don't agree with what we recommend. They have the right to challenge any decisions or, you know, things that we find about eligibility, evaluation, where we have placement, services that we provide. They have the right to challenge those. And if they disagree with the actions, or if they refuse to take action, they have the right to pursue a number of options. And those include trying to reach an agreement without bringing in any type of legal or mediation aspects. And this is always the one that we want to try to go with and achieve. We want to try to settle any concerns, any disputes without bringing in other parties. If that doesn't work, the parents have the right to ask for mediation, to ask for due process procedures, and to file a complaint with the state education agency. And once again, really it is important to try to fix these concerns, communicate, and really work toward building a good relationship to make sure that student has the best possible experience and provide for that student, because that's what it's all about, is providing for that student. One thing I'd like to mention is just because the parents sign the IEP, it doesn't mean that they agree with it. A signature simply states that they were there and that they were participants. They have the option of filing a dissenting report where they can outline the things that they don't agree with for the IEP. Also, if you have a team member that doesn't perhaps agree with everything that the team has decided to do, team members also can fill out dissenting reports as well. And this is just documenting their concerns or their disagreement with whatever aspect of the IEP they're looking at. So finally, one thing that we can do to deal with parental concerns, and kind of this is focusing on that first, come to an agreement step toward concerns or challenges, is to stay calm. Don't be defensive. Everybody wants to take part and they want to be heard. And when we're dealing with parents and we're talking about their son or daughter, it really is important to take into consideration their feelings, whether they're hearing that their child has a disability for the first time, or whether it's the fifth IEP meeting. It really is important to deal with empathy, sympathy, communication, and understanding, because it still is their child. So be aware of body language. Be aware of, whether or not you're being defensive, what the parents are trying to communicate. So it's really important to be an active listener and really communicate clearly with the parents, and to validate their concerns and their feelings, because they're a vital part of this team, and working once again towards the progress of that student and providing the best possible educational services for that student. We want to make sure that we give consideration to parent requests. Sometimes they'll ask for things that are out of our control or out of, what we can provide, but we can definitely, listen to them and then discuss the route for whether it's feasible or whether it isn't. The other thing that is really important is to demonstrate a we attitude. We don't want to blame, we don't want to say you're the problem or I'm the only one that does anything. Um, it's a we effort, it's a group effort, and we are working together to provide services, and we need to communicate to really keep everybody on the same page. Using that we attitude really can help parents feel at ease. Um, One thing that I always would like to do is I do encourage parents to bring in a support system. If they have a family member that knows something about special ed, or if they need an advocate or things like that, those people are always welcome, because the parents are coming into a large group of administrators and educators, and that can be pretty intimidating. So having them have their support system and support people at a meeting, I always would welcome that, because it's just putting everybody at ease a little bit, and the more the merrier, kind of, with how we can come together and collect ideas so that we really can go the extra mile to provide services. And sometimes we have good ideas that come from these other participants that really, can help with understanding the child, or, putting items in place. The other thing that is really important, and to me, this is one of the larger things, when we have parents coming into the meeting room, it's always hard for them to walk into a large group of professionals and everybody's, looking at them. That can be pretty intimidating, and they can be pretty self-conscious. One thing that I used to like to do is kind of stage it out. Once I had the parent, then have other people slowly trickle in, just to make sure that it's equal to when we're coming into the meeting area. It just allows for more of a relaxed feeling, and more of a general meeting where they're not coming in and everybody's kind of staring at them. So that's one thing that I found to be successful, is just making the meeting room, just kind of stagger it out where people are coming in, and it's just flowing more than just being, just walking into that large group. So, there's some other items for parental concerns, things that we can look at and we can do. But one of the main things is just to really show empathy, show that you care, active listening, and communication. Communication is key to building trust and building good rapport and relationships with not only the parents, but the service providers and our other colleagues. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation on the IEP process. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact myself at extension 4920, or amy.hughes@wgu.edu, and also to contact Dr. Lynn Brogan at extension 4110, or lynn.brogan@wgu.edu. Thank you.